You know that we talk a lot about redistricting, and recently we've been focused on the Senate Republicans' failure to honor that reform pledge that they made to former New York City Mayor Ed Koch during last year's campaign. Now, as you just heard from Majority Leader Dean Skelos, the conference is addressing this with a constitutional amendment. Assuming that could even pass, it would not impact the redrawing of the lines in 2012. And that has reform advocates concerned, to say the least, including my next guests, who are part of a new coalition called Reshape New York. John Avlon is a board member for the Citizens Union Foundation, as well as contributor to Newsweek and a commentator on CNN. And across the table from him is Dr. Gerald Benjamin, SUNY New Paltz professor of political science, and also my dad. Thanks for joining me.
Delightful to be here.
Thank you.
Good to be with you, Liz.
So this is actually in another also incarnation of your situation. You're heading or involved in something called No Labels, right? Which is a push for independent, nonpartisan government. Is that correct?
The idea behind that is to get Democrats and Republicans together to combat hyperpartisanship, because a group of us felt that Mark McKinnon, a notable Republican, many prominent Democrats, just that hyperpartisanship was hurting our country because it was stopping us from being able to solve the serious problems we face. And one of the key elements that leads to the hyperpartisanship in our politics is the rigged system of redistricting. There's no question. So that's why it needs to be dealt with right now.
Okay, but the problem is that it's not going to be dealt with right now if, in fact, the Senate Republicans go along the way that they are going. As a Republican, not to be put too fine a point on it, but not necessarily involved in state government, you can see the reason why they don't want to do it?
Well, when they were in the minority, they signed on to a pledge. When they retained the majority, they seem to have second and third thoughts about the pledge, to say the least.
Fifth, too.
And so it simply illustrates that parties that are in power and wish to retain power want to control drawing district lines. It's entirely a self-interested behavior. It delegitimizes government, undermines people's faith in the legislature, which has its other troubles, as we all know. So I'm really delighted that the Citizens Union has taken the lead in assembling this coalition and driving the focus of New York politics to this issue at a critical moment. Really, the only time we can do this, anything about this every decade is right now.
Yeah, and that's why there should be a real sense of urgency about this. This is the window. This can't wait. This needs to be dealt with now. And Citizens Union and Reshape New York have put together a coalition that's not only Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, but over 30 good government groups from across the city and state, realizing that time has come to push for this forward. The situational ethics that come when one party is in the minority, backs a reform, and then gets the majority and thinks better of it, that is a kind of cynical gamesmanship that just citizens should be outraged.
Okay, but they're not. That's the problem, right? They aren't outraged about it. They're outraged about a lot of things. They're outraged about high gas prices, about a failure to be able to get a job. They're outraged maybe about cuts to education aid. They are not outraged about redistricting.
You know, Liz, I actually think that folks are getting smarter about this because I think people are realizing, and I see this when I speak around the country, if I talk about redistricting, people who are frustrated about hyperpartisanship, about the extremes, the way they've hijacked our politics, the special interests, people understand that redistricting, the rigged system of redistricting, is one of the primary ways that we have this harsh but artificial division and polarization in our politics. People are smart, people are savvy, and that's why we're doing this segment right now, is to help educate people about why this is so important.
Okay, Dad, talk about the mechanics of this. For example, what the Senate Republicans want to do is a constitutional amendment, and it takes pretty much forever, and it's very difficult to do. I mean, when was the last time we actually amended a constitution this way?
Well, there are 3 or 4 embedded questions. Let's see if I can do it in a non-professorial way.
But that's why you're here.
Changing the Constitution by amendment requires passage in 2 separately elected legislatures.
Right.
So that means that you have to have an intervening election. That means that a constitution, even if we could get a constitutional amendment passed, this time it would have to be passed in a second legislature and put before the voters for referendum consideration.
So just simply put, it's punting, right?
It's very hard, but if we pass the statute, as somebody pointed out today in our press conference, if we pass the statute now, we could take the substance of that statute or substantially take it and put it into the Constitution. So passing statute now doesn't preclude amending the Constitution as a following step. And it's been done historically.
And that's why the folks who are arguing just for the constitutional maneuver are essentially lying to the people of New York. Delay is denial. when it comes to redistricting reform. If you want to move forward on parallel tracks, pursue the legislative aim, get it done now so it's impacted by the 2012 election, and then pursue the constitutional aim, because you're right, that will be more permanent. But it's not an either-or situation. And folks who are trying to present themselves as defenders of reform, pushing for the constitutional bit, they're lying to the people.
But if they say, if the Senate Republicans say, okay, you know, part of the reason why we have a problem with this is because we have a question as to the constitutionality of the actual bill that is being pushed by the governor. You're shaking your head.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, there may be some points of difference here. I would like them to specify what their constitutional problems are. If there are indeed constitutional problems in the draft legislation, then we can fix the legislation. There's no question that we can bring legislation in conformance to the state constitution, pass it this year, and have it effect in 2012. If you argue that there's a constitutional issue with the legislation, unspecified as yet, and then you argue, therefore we won't pass the legislation, you're effectively doing avoidance behavior. You know, and we know that we need therapy when that happens.
Which is expensive, by the way. We don't have a lot of money in New York.
That's exactly right. And so, but look, this is dressing up self-interest as high-minded principle, and it's a dodge. It's as simple as that. And that's why, look, if they have an issue, the constitutional issues that have been articulated to date are saying that there are problems with setting up a commission to do redistricting. Well, guess what? We already have a commission that does redistricting, and it's done by folks who have a real self-interest in the outcome. And that's why folks get so cynical, rightly so often, about Albany. That's why there's an obligation to take this opportunity now. This was clearly set forward. One of the things that Reshape New York has put forward is the broad coalitions of state senators and assemblymen who've already supported redistricting reform leading up to this election. 60 of the 62 senators have supported redistricting reform, either in principle, signing on to pledges, or legislation.
But
we should be able to move this ball forward.
I think also another argument that's been put out there, not necessarily by the Senate Republicans, but that I've heard, is that they're concerned about the separation of the legislative and executive powers, which is to say that the governor has, they argue, too much power in the bill that he's put forward in the Redistricting Act.
That's the aspect of the bill that's different than the generis bill is in the creation of the group that will select the pool from which the commission is selected.
It's awfully complicated.
And I'm not going to try to describe it here, but this is a minor point. You know, we're going to have to negotiate a budget of well in excess of $100 billion. Not everybody agrees on the particulars of that budget. We see that coming, those differences coming forward now with the so-called millionaires tax, blah blah, and those kinds of issues. Fundamentally, negotiation happens. If you don't like something in a bill, you don't say, change the Constitution and let's be perfect. You say, let's negotiate the particulars of the bill. Because I promised to pass a bill on this. I promised the voters when they voted for me, and I have to keep my promise.
You don't make the perfect enemy the good. And that's the larger point here. Look, the reason this matters to folks at home, and it should, go see the movie Gerrymandering. That'll give you a sense of what matters.
Done something on this.
Go pay attention to what Tom DeLay tried to do in Texas. And then look at when state legislative leaders here promise oblivion to their political opponents, you'll see just how cynical and self-interested the current system is. People should be furious that in New York we have so many districts that don't have general elections. Effectively, the election is over in a close partisan primary.
Yeah, and John, the oblivion quote, that came from a Democrat.
Yes, it did.
To be clear, right?
Absolutely,
so when the Democrats were in power, you had a Democrat named Malcolm Smith, who at the time was president of the Senate, who said, I can't wait. Well, he didn't say this. This is not an exact quote, but the oblivion was an exact quote word that he used. We could redistrict them into oblivion, which is exactly what the Senate Republicans are afraid of. So can you blame them?
Well, you know, my analysis of this is sort of interesting. The Senate Republicans presume that if they control districting, they can save themselves. The fact of the matter is that the demographics of New York are very challenging to Republicans. I say that as a Republican. So the challenge for Republicans is to be competitive in New York, not to draw districts to hold on for a couple more elections until you fade away because the demographics overwhelm you. You have to address the constituencies in ways that appeal to them so that you can win elections for the legislature, not just statewide.
And that attempt to delay demographic change is what got Democrats, one of the things that got Democrats in the South in trouble, which is how we got in this whole new era of gerrymandering.
Right.
I mean, look, what we have amounts to a denial of representative democracy because you end up getting safe seats. And what it does is it polarizes our politics. It empowers the extremes. You get average 10% turnout for closed partisan primaries. That makes 5.1% of the electorate a majority. And that causes the politicians, creates an incentive structure where they play to the base all the time and they systematically ignore the other 95%.
And we should just say it is possible to succeed in New York, and I know this is not something that you're necessarily going to agree with, not from a legislative standpoint, but Carl Palladino, hate him, love him, etc., managed to play to a base and managed to do well, right? So it is possible as a very conservative Republican to do well in New York if, in fact, you ride a wave, you catch whatever.
And you take your party off a cliff in what was otherwise a very
I'm not saying it was a good idea. I'm just saying it is possible to be successful.
The thing I prefer, the example I prefer to give is this: if you're in Manhattan and you walk into a 24/7 grocery, and you find that it's run by a Korean family or an immigrant family that's putting their kids through college, the values are fundamentally conservative, and yet no appeals are being made by conservative forces in politics to people who own their own homes and pay property taxes in Queens and are working 12 hours a day and paying high tuitions at universities so their kids can be, in the next generation, be professionals. Instead, they're written off. And being competitive is the way to succeed. And we want to create rules that require people to be competitive rather than backing off.
Let me just ask you, because we're going to run out of time. I just want to ask this question. This is redistricting reform a little bit high-minded, right? What you're saying here is small d democracy. That's why we want it. Competitiveness. We want a bipartisanship, an end to polarization of politics in this country, in the state, etc. In order to get this bill, you may have to do a lot of horse trading, a lot of backroom political deals. Is it worth it?
Absolutely.
Well, I think so. Well, fundamentally, Liz, one reason it's important to do this by statute is because the governor's in the picture for making statutes. The governor's not in the picture for making constitutional amendments.
Right.
So now the governor has said, I'm going to veto a bill unless it comes forward from this new process. So you have a very powerful friend committed who's going to engage with this. In previous administrations, unfortunately, governors have always traded this when push came to shove. But now you have the guy on the line, and that's fundamentally important.
If folks at home are sick of the hyperpartisanship and the partisan infighting in our politics and the gridlock, they need to understand that this is the reform that can help move all the others forward. By changing the dynamics and creating incentive for politicians to compete in general elections and reach across the aisle and form constructive coalitions, that opens the door to a totally different kind of politics. That's why we should feel a fierce urgency of now win this district. This comes around every 10 years. This will not happen again for another decade, folks. So if that stuff's angering you in Washington or Albany, now's the time to put pressure. Now's the time to put folks in Albany accountable for their campaign promises.
Well, we will see. Unfortunately, we are out of time for now. John Avlon, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And Dad, Jerry Benjamin, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great pleasure to be here.